David Carter was down to his last dollar, until one morning, he recognized a familiar face leaving a high-rise. Warren Buffett, the billionaire oracle of Omaha, was just another passerby to the city's daily rush. Desperate and hungry, David mustered the courage to ask for a single dollar. What happened next wasn't just a handout. It was an invitation that would rewrite David's life. In a world where fortunes can shift in an instant, discover the conversation that changed everything for a man who thought hope was lost. The morning air in Omaha was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. It was just another day in the bustling city, where businessmen in tailored suits rushed past students clutching textbooks and workers carried steaming cups of their morning brew. The sidewalks pulsed with life, each person lost in their own world. But for David Carter, this day was different. This was the day he would take a step he had never taken before. David sat on a worn-out bench outside a high-rise office building, pulling his tattered coat tighter around his shoulders. He had seen better days, far better days. Just 3 years ago, he had an apartment, a steady job at a printing press, and enough money to get by. But life had a way of unraveling everything in an instant. First came the layoff, then the eviction, then the nights spent in shelters, followed by the realization that those shelters filled up fast in the winter. Now, at 54, he found himself living on the streets, surviving on whatever he could scrape together. He had always told himself he would never beg. He had pride. He had dignity. But dignity didn't keep the hunger pangs at bay. Dignity didn't stop the wind from cutting through his clothes. He had spent the last few nights under an overpass, using old newspapers for warmth, and this morning, his stomach ached from going without food for over a day. As he sat watching the endless stream of people walk past, he saw a familiar figure emerging from the building. A man in his early 90s, walking with purpose, surrounded by 2 aides. His white hair, neatly combed back, was unmistakable. His glasses reflected the morning sunlight as he adjusted them with practiced ease. Warren Buffett. David had seen him before, of course, on magazine covers, on television interviews, in the headlines about billion-dollar deals. The Oracle of Omaha, they called him. A man who had built an empire from nothing, who had more wealth than David could even comprehend. But at that moment, Buffett wasn't just a billionaire. He was a passerby, just another human being moving through the city. The words were out before David could stop them. "Excuse me, sir. Can you spare $1?" The moment the words left his lips, regret hit him like a freight train. What was he thinking? Asking a man worth billions for a single dollar? He braced himself for what usually came next. Averted eyes, a dismissive wave, or worse, complete silence. He wished he could take the words back, wished he had just let Buffett pass by without embarrassing himself. But Buffett stopped. He turned, adjusting his glasses, and looked directly at David, not past him, not through him, but at him. The 2 aides beside Buffett exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for their boss to move along. Buffett smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't forced or impatient. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping through the crisp bills inside. $1? Buffett mused. Why $1? David swallowed hard. The question caught him off guard. Usually when he asked, people either ignored him or tossed some change his way without another word. But this man, this billionaire, was asking him why. "Just need something to eat," David admitted, his voice rough from lack of use. Buffett nodded, as if considering the request. Then, instead of handing David $1, he did something that made the aides exchange even more puzzled looks. "How about breakfast instead?" Buffett asked. David blinked. "What?" Buffett gestured toward the cafe across the street. "Come on, let's sit down and have a meal." The aides looked uncertain, one of them clearing his throat. "Sir, you have a meeting in 20 minutes. Buffett waved a hand dismissively. "It can wait. This is more important." David hesitated. Was this a trick? A joke? He had been on the receiving end of cruel pranks before. People who pretended to be kind, only to mock him later. But there was something about the way Buffett said it, something genuine that made David believe this wasn't one of those moments. Still, he hesitated. Buffett must have sensed it because he chuckled and said, "If you're worried about paying me back, don't be. Just humor an old man and join me for breakfast." David forced himself to his feet, his legs stiff from sitting too long on the cold bench. Buffett didn't wait for an answer. He simply started walking toward the cafe, expecting David to follow. Inside, the warmth was almost overwhelming. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, and David's stomach clenched painfully at the thought of food. Buffett chose a booth near the window and gestured for David to sit across from him. "Order whatever you want," Buffett said, handing him a menu. David stared at it, overwhelmed. It had been a long time since he had chosen his own meal instead of taking whatever was handed to him at a shelter. He settled on scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Buffett ordered the same. As they waited, Buffett studied David with quiet interest. "So tell me," he said, "how'd you end up here?" David hesitated, but something about Buffett's tone, curious, not judgmental, made him answer. He spoke about the layoff, the eviction, the slow descent into homelessness. Buffett listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When David finished, he felt exposed, as if he had laid bare all his failures to a man who had only ever known success. He expected Buffett to offer some generic platitude, something like tough luck or keep your chin up. Instead, Buffett leaned forward. "What did you do before the printing press?" David frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I was in sales for a while. Used to work at a car dealership before that." Buffett smiled. "Sales, huh? That's a skill you never lose. You ever think about getting back into it?" David scoffed. "Who's gonna hire a guy who looks like this?" He gestured to his worn-out coat, his unshaven face. "People don't see past appearances." Buffett tilted his head. "I do." David didn't know what to say to that. Their food arrived, and for a few moments, there was only the sound of clinking silverware. David ate slowly, savoring each bite. Buffett, despite being a billionaire, ate like a regular guy. No pretense, no airs. As they finished, Buffett reached into his pocket again, but this time, he didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go to this address," Buffett said. "There's a company I know that's always looking for good salespeople. They'll take care of you." David stared at the card, the weight of it sinking in. "Why are you doing this?" Buffett smiled. "Because sometimes all a person needs is a chance, and because you asked for $1 when you could have asked for more." David swallowed hard, gripping the card like it was his lifeline. Buffett stood, adjusting his coat. "Use it, or don't. But something tells me you will." And with that, he walked out, his aides trailing behind him. David sat there for a long time, staring at the card. Then, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe, just a little, in second chances. The cold morning air settled heavily over the streets of Omaha, clinging to the pavement and creeping through the worn fabric of David Carter's coat. He pulled the collar up around his neck, but it did little to keep the chill away. His fingers, stiff from the cold, curled deeper into his sleeves as he sat on the edge of a weathered bench outside a towering office building. The streets around him were coming alive, filled with the rhythmic clatter of heels on pavement, the murmur of voices lost in conversation, and the occasional honk of a distant car horn. The world moved forward, as it always did, and David remained exactly where he had been for the past 3 weeks. He had once walked these streets with purpose, with a sense of belonging. There was a time when he had a neatly pressed suit, a reliable car, and a warm home to return to at the end of a long day. That was before everything unraveled. A company restructuring led to layoffs, and his job in sales was one of the first to go. At first, he told himself it was temporary. He had experience, connections. Something would turn up. But the months dragged on, and each rejection chipped away at the confidence he had spent years building. Then came the eviction. Without a steady income, savings drained faster than he ever imagined. He had no family to fall back on. His parents had passed years ago, and his only sibling, a brother, had long since moved across the country. Friends who once shared drinks and stories with him at company events slowly distanced themselves when they realized he had nothing left to offer. Pride had kept him from asking for help until it was too late. Now, his days were spent in the same routine. Wake up before sunrise, find a public restroom to clean up, and spend the day blending into the city. He never begged. He never held a sign or extended his hand. He simply existed, hoping that somehow, some way, he could find a way back to the life he had lost. His stomach ached from hunger. The last meal he had was half a sandwich a kind stranger had handed him yesterday afternoon. It hadn't been enough, but he had learned to ignore the pangs, to let them become just another part of the background noise of his life. The few coins in his pocket weren't enough for a meal, and he knew the soup kitchen wouldn't open for hours. As he sat there, watching the steady stream of people passing by, his eyes landed on a familiar figure stepping out of the building across the street. The older man moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his white hair neatly combed back, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he adjusted them with one hand. Warren Buffett. David had seen him before, of course. Everyone had. His face was recognizable from magazine covers, news articles, and television interviews. The Oracle of Omaha, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who had more wealth than David could even comprehend. He was surrounded by two aides, both dressed in suits, speaking to him in hushed tones as they walked. David knew he should look away, pretend he hadn't noticed, just like he did with everyone else. But something inside him stirred. He didn't need much, just enough for a coffee, something to quiet the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. The words were out before he could stop them. "Excuse me, sir, can you spare $1?" The moment the question left his lips, he felt a sharp pang of regret. What was he thinking? Asking a billionaire for $1? He braced himself for what usually followed: an awkward glance, a dismissive shake of the head, or worse, complete silence. He almost wished he could take it back. But Buffett stopped. He turned, adjusting his glasses, and looked directly at David. Not past him, not through him, but at him. The aides hesitated, their conversations trailing off as they waited for their boss to move along. Buffett smiled, not the polite, distant kind, but a genuine, curious smile. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and flipped through the bills inside. $1? Buffett mused. Why $1? David swallowed hard. The question caught him off guard. He had expected silence, maybe an uncomfortable shrug, but not this. Not an actual conversation. "Just need something to eat?" David admitted, his voice rough from disuse. Buffett nodded, as if considering the answer, but instead of handing David $1, he did something that made the aides exchange puzzled looks. "How about breakfast instead?" David blinked. "What?" Buffett gestured to the cafe across the street. "Let's sit down and have a meal." One of the aides cleared his throat. "Sir, you have a meeting in 20 minutes. Buffett waved a hand dismissively. "It can wait. This is more important." David hesitated. Was this a trick? A joke? He had been on the receiving end of cruel pranks before, people pretending to be kind only to mock him later. But there was something in Buffett's voice, something sincere, that made him believe this wasn't one of those moments. Still, he hesitated. Buffett must have sensed it because he chuckled and said, "If you're worried about paying me back, don't be. Just humor an old man and join me for breakfast." David forced himself to his feet, his legs stiff from sitting too long on the cold bench. Buffett didn't wait for an answer. He simply started walking toward the cafe, expecting David to follow. Inside, the warmth was almost overwhelming. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, making David's stomach twist painfully. Buffett chose a booth near the window and gestured for David to sit across from him. "Order whatever you want," Buffett said, handing him a menu. David stared at it, overwhelmed. It had been a long time since he had chosen his own meal instead of taking whatever was handed to him at a shelter. He settled on scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Buffett ordered the same. As they waited, Buffett studied David with quiet interest. "So, tell me," he said, "how'd you end up here?" David hesitated but answered. He spoke about the layoff, the eviction, the slow descent into homelessness. Buffett listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When David finished, he felt exposed, as if he had laid bare all his failures to a man who had only ever known success. Buffett leaned forward. "What did you do before the printing press?" David frowned. "I was in sales. Used to work at a car dealership before that." Buffett smiled. "Sales, huh? That's a skill you never lose. You ever think about getting back into it?" David scoffed. "Who's gonna hire a guy who looks like this?" Buffett tilted his head. "I would." David stared at him. "What?" Buffett pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go to this address. They're expecting you." David swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Buffett smiled. "Because sometimes all a person needs is a chance." David clutched the card like a lifeline. Buffett stood, adjusting his coat. "Use it, or don't, but something tells me you will." And with that, he walked out. David sat there, staring at the card, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving as David Carter sat on a worn-out bench outside a towering office building in downtown Omaha. The wind cut through his tattered coat, and his breath formed little clouds in the air. His fingers, numb from the cold, curled into fists inside his sleeves, but it did little to warm them. The hunger in his stomach had become a dull, constant ache, something he had grown accustomed to over the months of living on the streets. He watched as the city came to life around him, the hum of engines, the hurried footsteps of professionals heading to work, the distant honking of impatient drivers caught in the early morning rush. People walked past him without a second glance, their eyes fixed ahead, their faces unreadable. He had become invisible, another forgotten soul blending into the background of a world too busy to notice. There was a time when he had been one of them, stepping out of his apartment each morning with a sense of purpose, grabbing a coffee on the way to his job in sales. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, kept food on the table, gave him a sense of stability. Then came the layoff. One bad quarter, a round of corporate downsizing, and just like that, he was packing up his desk with a severance check that wouldn't last long. He told himself he would find another job soon. He sent out resumes, went to interviews, but rejection after rejection wore him down. The savings disappeared faster than he expected, the bills piled up, and when he could no longer make rent, the eviction notice came. At first, he stayed with friends, but he hated being a burden, and eventually, he ran out of places to go. The shelters were full, the waiting lists endless, and so, the streets became his home. He had been living like this for almost a year now. Some days were easier than others, but every day was a struggle. He had long given up on pride. He searched for food where he could, accepted what little kindness came his way, and kept his head down. He never begged, never held out a cup, never asked for anything, until today. His stomach twisted painfully, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. Across the street, the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted from a cafe, taunting him with what he couldn't have. His fingers tightened into his sleeves, and he tried to push the thought away, tried to convince himself he could hold on a little longer. Then the doors of the building beside him opened, and a small group of men stepped out. They walked with in conversation, their voices low but firm. Their suits were immaculate, their shoes polished to a shine. They were the kind of men who never had to worry about where their next meal would come from, the kind of men David used to work for. He barely glanced at them, expecting them to pass by without a second look, just like everyone else. But then, something made him pause. One of the men was different. He wasn't dressed like the others. No expensive suit, no polished shoes, just a simple button-down shirt, slacks, and a quiet presence that somehow commanded more respect than the men in tailored suits. His hair was graying at the temples, and there was something about his face. Kind, thoughtful, familiar. David's brow furrowed as recognition hit him like a slow wave. Warren Buffett. It was surreal, watching the billionaire walk past him like any other businessman, unassuming and without an entourage. He had read about Buffett years ago, admired his work, his approach to business, his philanthropy. But now, all David could think about was the dollar in his pocket, the last dollar he had left. A single dollar wouldn't get him much, certainly not a meal, not in this city. And for the first time in his life, he found himself considering something he never thought he would do: ask for help. His mouth felt dry, his pride warring with his desperation. The words sat heavy on his tongue, almost refusing to come out. But then he thought of how cold the night would be, of how his stomach clenched in protest, of how much he missed feeling human. And so, before he could talk himself out of it, he forced the words past his lips. "Sir, could you spare $1?" It was barely louder than a whisper, but somehow it cut through the morning noise. The men walking with Buffett hesitated, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. One of them shot David a quick glance, then looked away, clearly expecting Buffett to keep walking. But he didn't. Instead, Warren Buffett turned, his eyes settling on David with quiet curiosity. There was no judgment in his expression, no discomfort, just a thoughtful consideration. He stepped closer, and for the first time in months, David felt like someone actually saw him. Buffett tilted his head slightly. $1? He asked, his voice even, unreadable. David nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a dismissive nod, maybe a polite refusal. What he didn't expect was for Buffett to reach into his pocket, pull out a crisp bill, and extend it to him without hesitation. But just as David reached to take it, Buffett didn't let go. "Tell me something," Buffett said, his voice still calm. "What would you do with this dollar?" David hesitated. It was a simple question, but it carried weight. He could lie, say something that would make him seem more deserving. But what was the point? He had nothing left to lose. "I'd get something to eat," he admitted honestly. Buffett studied him for a long moment, then released the dollar into David's hand. But instead of walking away, he did something no one else had done in a long time. He sat down beside him. The other businessmen looked startled, exchanging glances, clearly unsure of what to do. But Buffett waved them off, and one by one they slowly backed away, giving them space. David stared at him in disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" Buffett smiled faintly. "Because most people wouldn't," he said simply. "And because I think there's more to your story than just needing $1." David swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around the bill, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that someone, one of the most powerful men in the world, was willing to sit down and listen. For the first time in a long time, David felt like more than just another forgotten soul on the street. He felt human. David shifted uncomfortably, still gripping the dollar like it was the last piece of dignity he had left. Warren Buffett sat beside him with an ease that made it seem like this was just another conversation, as if he were speaking to a fellow investor over coffee rather than a homeless man on the sidewalk. The city around them didn't stop moving. Taxis honked. Businessmen hurried past. A street vendor called out his daily specials. But for David, time felt like it had slowed. Buffett studied him for a moment, then clasped his hands together. "Tell me," he said, his tone neither demanding nor impatient. "How did you get here?" David let out a slow breath. feeling the weight of the question settle on his chest. He thought about lying, saying something that would make him sound less like a failure. But what was the point? This man had built empires, seen fortunes rise and fall. He would see through anything less than the truth. "I had a life once," David admitted, his voice rough from disuse. "A good one. A job, a home, a family." Buffett nodded, waiting, not rushing him. "I worked in finance," David continued, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not at your level, obviously, but I wasn't struggling. I had a decent job. Middle management at a firm in Chicago. I was good with numbers, not great, but good. My wife used to joke that I could predict stock trends better than I could predict what she wanted for dinner." He huffed a quiet laugh at the memory, but it faded as quickly as it came. "So what happened?" Buffett asked, his voice patient, not probing. "So what happened?" Buffett asked, his voice patient, not probing. David exhaled through his nose, looking down at the crumpled cuffs of his sleeves. "The recession," he said finally. "Lost my job. Thought I could bounce back, but the market didn't recover fast enough. Bills piled up. We sold the house to stay afloat, moved into an apartment, but then..." He hesitated. "Then my wife got sick." Buffett's face remained neutral, but his eyes softened. "Cancer," David said, the word tasting like rust in his mouth. "We had insurance, but it wasn't enough. Savings ran dry fast. I took out loans, tried everything to keep up. But in the end, the debt was too much. I lost her. And then I lost everything else." Buffett sat with the silence that followed, not filling it with empty condolences. He simply absorbed the weight of what David had just said. David cleared his throat, trying to shake the lump forming there. "I kept looking for work. I tried, but I was drowning in medical debt, my credit was shot, and every door I knocked on stayed shut." He let out a dry laugh. "Turns out, when you hit rock bottom, people stop returning your calls." Buffett nodded slowly. "The system isn't built to catch people on the way down, just to congratulate them when they get back up." David looked at him then, surprised at the understanding in his voice. Buffett glanced at the street, watching people pass by, oblivious to their conversation. "I've met a lot of successful people in my life," he mused, "and I can tell you that luck plays a bigger role than most of them would like to admit. The right opportunities, the right connections, the right timing. It's not all about hard work." He turned back to David. "But the thing is, you had all of that once, which means you can have it again." David scoffed. "I appreciate the optimism, but I don't think Wall Street is looking to hire guys who sleep on sidewalks." Buffett chuckled. "Maybe not Wall Street, but that doesn't mean there isn't a way back for you." David frowned. "What do you mean?" Buffett leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me, David, if you had one chance, just one, to get back on your feet, what would you do?" David hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had asked him that, since anyone had believed he could do anything other than survive another day. He thought about it, really thought about it. And for the first time in years, he let himself imagine a different life. "I'd start over," he said, almost to himself. "Not in finance, something different, something that actually helps people. Maybe something in financial literacy, helping people avoid the mistakes I made." He looked up at Buffett, suddenly embarrassed by the confession. "But that's just a dream." Buffett smiled, slow and knowing. "Dreams are just plans waiting for execution." David let out a breath. "Easy for you to say. You're Warren Buffett." Buffett chuckled. "I wasn't always." They sat in silence for a beat before Buffett reached into his pocket, but this time, he didn't pull out another dollar. Instead, he retrieved a business card. He flipped it between his fingers for a moment before handing it to David. "There's a job fair happening tomorrow," Buffett said. "It's hosted by one of my foundations. It's not finance, but they're looking for people with management experience. If you show up, I'll make sure someone there knows to expect you." David blinked at him, barely able to process what he was hearing. "You'd do that? For me?" Buffett smiled. "Let's just say I like investing in potential." David stared at the card, his fingers brushing over the embossed letters. It felt real, more real than anything had in years. Buffett stood, dusting off his slacks. "Now, I believe you said you needed something to eat." He gestured toward the corner. "There's a cafe right there. Let's get you something more than just $1's worth of food." David hesitated for only a second before standing as well, feeling something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. David followed Warren Buffett toward the small cafe on the corner, his mind still reeling. The weight of the business card in his pocket felt heavier than it should, like it carried something far more valuable than just contact information. He tried not to let himself believe in the possibility of a new beginning. Not yet. He had learned the hard way that hope, when misplaced, could be as cruel as hunger. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, chasing away the lingering chill from the street. The scent of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air, making David's stomach tighten painfully. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a real meal, something more than scraps or handouts. Buffett stepped up to the counter and gave the cashier a small nod. "2 breakfasts, please. Whatever's best." David shifted uncomfortably. "You don't have to—" Buffett waved a hand. "David, let me teach you something about investing." He gestured toward the seats by the window, where they could watch the city move around them. "It's not always about money. Sometimes it's about people. About believing in someone when they don't have the strength to believe in themselves." David hesitated, then sat across from Buffett, his fingers tapping anxiously against the tabletop. "Why me?" he asked after a moment. "You must walk past dozens of people like me every day. What made you stop?" Buffett studied him, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Because I've seen your face before." David frowned. "What?" Buffett nodded. "Not literally, of course, but I've seen what happens when a good man loses everything. I've seen what happens when life gives someone one bad hand after another, and they start to believe they don't have a way out. The truth is, David, a lot of people are closer to where you are now than they think." David swallowed hard, glancing out the window at the businessmen in their tailored suits, the women in their heels rushing to their offices, the taxi drivers weaving through traffic. They all seemed so far away from him now, like a different species entirely. The food arrived, plates piled high with eggs, bacon, toast, and fresh fruit. David's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his fork, the warmth of the plate almost foreign to him. He had spent so long being ignored, passed by as if he were just another piece of the city's background noise. But now, he was sitting across from one of the richest men in the world, being treated as if he mattered. Buffett took a sip of his coffee, watching him. "You said you used to work in finance," he prompted. "Tell me about that." David chewed slowly, savoring the taste of real food before answering. "I wasn't anyone important. I analyzed market trends, helped clients manage risk. I was good at it, but I wasn't a genius or anything." He set his fork down, rubbing the back of his neck. "I thought I had it all figured out, thought I was being smart with my money, but when everything started falling apart, I realized how little I really knew." Buffett nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" David exhaled through his nose. "Now I see things differently. I used to think financial security was about making the right moves, playing the game better than everyone else. But I've learned that most people don't get second chances. They don't have safety nets. They don't have someone stopping to help them back up." Buffett smiled slightly. "That's an important lesson. Most people at the top don't realize how easily they could have been on the other side of the equation." David stared down at his plate, his appetite suddenly replaced by something heavier. "So what happens now?" Buffett set his coffee down and reached into his jacket pocket. This time, he pulled out a different card. Not just his personal assistant's number, but something else. He slid it across the table. "This is a contact at a nonprofit I work with," Buffett said. "They focus on financial education, helping people rebuild after losing everything. They need someone who understands finance but also understands what it's like to struggle. Someone who can teach real-world survival, not just theory." David blinked at him, processing what he was saying. "You think I could do that?" Buffett shrugged. "You've already learned lessons that take most people a lifetime to understand. The question is, do you want to use them?" David stared at the card, his fingers running over the embossed lettering. It wasn't a handout. It wasn't charity. It was a chance, a real, tangible chance. Buffett leaned forward, his tone softer now. "No one can make this choice for you, David. But I'll tell you this. When life gives you a rare second opportunity, you take it. Because if you don't, one day you'll look back and wonder if that was the moment everything could have changed." David nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he was ready to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over yet. David sat there, staring at the card in his hand, tracing the letters with his thumb. It felt unreal. A name, a number, and an opportunity. Not a guarantee, not a gift, but a door left slightly open. And all he had to do was find the strength to step through it. Across from him, Warren Buffett took another sip of his coffee, watching him with an expression that was hard to read. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't charity. It was expectation. A quiet, unspoken challenge. David swallowed hard. His mind raced with all the reasons this wouldn't work. He hadn't been in an office in years. His resume was a mess. Who would take him seriously, sitting there in his threadbare coat, his hands still rough from too many nights in the cold? And yet, Buffett had stopped. He had listened. And now he was giving him something that no one else had. A chance. David exhaled slowly. "So what do I do?" Buffett set his cup down with a soft clink. "You call the number. You tell them I sent you. You show up. You prove that you're worth the investment." David nodded, gripping the card a little tighter. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something unfamiliar. Hope. Outside, the city moved around them. People hurried past the cafe window, lost in their own lives, their own worries. A few glanced in, some even recognizing Buffett and whispering to one another. But none of them noticed David. Not yet. Buffett checked his watch, then gave David a final appraising look. "You know, most people think success is about never falling. It's not. It's about getting back up, every time." David met his gaze, something tightening in his chest. For years, he had believed he had failed for the last time. That some people just didn't get another chance. But maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. He looked down at the card one last time, then slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. And as Warren Buffett stood to leave, David did something he hadn't done in a long, long time. He let himself believe. David sat in the quiet cafe long after Warren Buffett had left. The small white business card in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of all the decisions he had ever made. He turned his coffee cup in slow circles on the table, watching the last few drops swirl at the bottom. Outside, the city moved forward, relentless and indifferent, but for the first time in years, David felt like he might have a reason to move with it. The number on the card. It was such a small thing, just a string of digits, but it might as well have been a mountain. He had made plenty of calls in his life. Calls for jobs, calls for help, calls he never wanted to make. But this was different. This was a door, barely open, and if he walked through it, there was no telling what would be on the other side. His fingers twitched toward his pocket, brushing against the edge of the card, then pulled back. Not yet. He had spent too long feeling like a ghost in his own life, fading at the edges, unseen, unnoticed. Maybe he needed just one more moment to sit here, to gather himself, to believe that this was real. The waitress approached, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes kind but cautious. "You need anything else?" David looked up, startled. How long had he been sitting there? He shook his head. "Number, I'm good. Thanks." She hesitated, then nodded, moving away. He could tell she wanted to ask why he hadn't left yet, why a man in a worn-out coat with rough hands and tired eyes was sitting at a table where Warren Buffett had just been. Maybe she thought he had just been another stranger in need of charity. Maybe she thought he was wasting an opportunity that someone else would have grabbed without hesitation. David pushed back from the table, slipping the card from his pocket and staring at it. The number. He took a breath, then another. He reached for his phone, hands shaking, and dialed. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice answered. "This is Daniel Whitmore's office." David's throat went dry. Hi, my name is David. Warren Buffett told me to call." A pause, then, "Hold one moment." David clenched the phone tighter, his other hand forming a fist against his knee. The background noise on the other end shifted, and a different voice came on, deeper, professional. "Mr. Walker?" David swallowed. "Yes, sir." "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I was just briefed by Mr. Buffett. I understand you're looking for a fresh start." David's mind scrambled for words. Yes, I am." Whitmore didn't sound skeptical or rushed, just matter of fact. "I'd like you to come in this afternoon. Can you do that?" David blinked. Afternoon. Today. He had expected a drawn-out process, something that would take weeks, if it happened at all. "Yes, I can be there." "Good. 3 o'clock. Bring anything you have. Resume, ID, anything relevant. And Mr. Walker?" "Yes." "Be on time." The line went dead. David stared at his phone, then at the business card still in his other hand. 3 o'clock. He checked the time. He had less than 3 hours. Panic shot through him. He had nothing. No clean clothes, no resume, no idea what to expect. But then, another thought followed. He had an opportunity. For the first time in years, he had something to fight for. He shoved the card back into his pocket and stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. The waitress looked over, startled. David forced a small, uncertain smile. "Thanks for the coffee." Then he walked out the door, stepping into the cold air, into the city, into a future that had seemed impossible just an hour ago. The bus ride across town felt surreal. The city he had spent years wandering through, a place he knew by its alleys and shelters, now seemed like unfamiliar territory. He wasn't looking for a warm place to sleep or a handout. He was looking for a second chance. The stop came faster than he expected, and suddenly he was standing outside a gleaming office building, his reflection staring back at him from the glass doors. He had showered at a shelter, borrowed a button-down shirt from an old friend, and even managed to scrape together a printed copy of an old resume. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do on such short notice. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lobby was bright, polished, filled with people who walked like they had places to be. A receptionist looked up as he approached, offering a professional smile. "Can I help you?" David cleared his throat. "I have a 3 o'clock with Mr. Whitmore." Her eyes flicked down to the schedule. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes." She nodded. "Take a seat. He'll be with you shortly." David sat down, gripping his folder tight. The minutes stretched, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. Then, a man in a sharp suit stepped into view. "David Walker?" David stood. "Yes, sir." Daniel Whitmore studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. David shook it, his grip firm despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. "Come with me," Whitmore said. David followed him through the glass doors, past offices filled with people typing, talking, working. It was a world he had been shut out of for so long, and now he was walking straight into it. They entered a quiet conference room, and Whitmore gestured for him to sit. David did, setting his folder carefully on the table. Whitmore folded his hands. "Tell me about yourself." David took a breath, and then, for the first time in years, he did. He told the truth, the full, unvarnished truth. His work history, his fall, his struggles, the good and the bad. He laid it all out, his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Whitmore's. When he finished, there was silence. Then Whitmore nodded. "You're honest? That's a good start." David held his breath as Whitmore reached for a folder of his own, flipping through it. "I have a position that might suit you," he said finally. "It's not glamorous. It's not easy. But it's a beginning." David's fingers tightened on the chair. "I'll take it." Whitmore smiled slightly. "I haven't told you the details." David smiled back, something fierce and determined settling in his chest. "I don't need to hear them. I'll take it." Whitmore considered him for a long moment, then nodded. "Welcome aboard." David exhaled sharply, feeling something crack open inside him. Something he thought he had lost a long time ago. A future, a chance, a way forward. And it had all started with a simple question. $1. But what he had received was worth infinitely more. David stepped out of the building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The city hummed around him, indifferent yet alive. But for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just passing through. He belonged. He clutched the folder in his hands, the weight of his new job offer pressing against his fingertips, grounding him in reality. He had done it. As he walked down the street, a strange mix of emotions swirled inside him. Relief, disbelief, gratitude, fear. He was standing at the edge of something new, something terrifyingly hopeful. After years of struggling just to survive, he finally had a direction, a purpose. But the weight of that reality was almost too much to process. He found himself wandering without thinking, letting his feet take him where they wanted. The streets felt different now, as if they had shifted slightly, realigning themselves to fit this new version of his life. The worn-out alleys and park benches that had once been his shelter were now just part of the past, places he could walk past without needing to stop. He reached a small diner tucked between two office buildings. The neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering as if it couldn't decide whether to stay lit or give up entirely. David hesitated, then stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the warm scent of coffee and grilled food washed over him. The waitress, a woman in her mid-50s with tired eyes and a kind smile, glanced up from behind the counter. "Take a seat anywhere, hun," she said. David nodded, sliding into a booth near the window. He hadn't eaten in almost a day, but now, for the first time in a long while, he could actually afford to order something more than just the cheapest item on the menu. He reached into his pocket, feeling for the few bills he had left after taking the bus to his meeting. Enough for a meal, maybe even dessert. The thought felt almost surreal. The waitress approached, notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" David hesitated for a second, then smiled. "A cheeseburger, fries, and a coffee, please." She scribbled it down and gave him a nod. "Good choice. You look like you could use a good meal." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, you could say that." As he waited, he pulled out the folder again, flipping through the paperwork. The job offer was real. The salary, the benefits, everything was right there in black and white. He ran his fingers over the paper, half expecting it to disappear, to wake up and find himself back on a bench, shivering in the cold. But it was real. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down with a small clink. "You celebrating something?" she asked, nodding toward the folder. David glanced at it, then exhaled. Yeah, in a way. She didn't press, just smiled and patted the table before walking away. As he took his first sip of coffee, his mind drifted back to Warren Buffett. The old man's words echoed in his head, the way he had looked at David, not with pity, but with recognition. You're not broken, David. You just need a chance. That chance had come, and now it was up to him to prove that he could take it. The food arrived, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to enjoy a meal without worrying about where the next one would come from. Every bite was a reminder that he was stepping into something new, something better. After he finished, he lingered for a while, staring out the window at the people rushing by. He used to be invisible to them. Maybe, in some ways, he still was. But now he had something more than just survival. He had a future. He pulled out his phone, staring at the number on the business card once more. There was one more call he needed to make. His fingers hovered over the screen before he finally pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. Hello? David swallowed. Hey, John, it's me. A pause, then a sharp intake of breath. David? Yeah. Another pause. Then, where the hell have you been? David exhaled, his grip tightening on the phone. It's a long story, but I think I'm finally getting back on my feet. Silence. Then softer this time. Yeah? Yeah. John let out a slow breath. Damn, man. You have no idea how good it is to hear that. David smiled. Yeah, I think I do. They talked for a while. About the job, about where he'd been, about things neither of them had been able to say before. And when the call ended, David felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just getting a job, he wasn't just getting off the streets. He was getting his life back. And for the first time in years, he was ready to live it. He wanted to believe that. With a nod, he reached for his wallet, the one that had spent too many years nearly empty. It was still light, but for once, not as light as before. He pulled out the money for his meal and placed it on the table, adding a little extra for the tip. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small way to say thank you to a stranger who had treated him like a person when so many others had looked through him like he wasn't even there. David sat in the diner long after his plate had been cleared, his fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup as he stared out the window. The world outside moved on at its usual hurried pace. People weaving between traffic, taxis honking, businessmen checking their watches as they rushed past. It was the same city, the same streets he had walked for years, but something about it felt different now. Or maybe he was different. For the first time in years, he wasn't just another face in the crowd, another forgotten person struggling to make it through the day. He had a job, a real job, a place to be, a paycheck coming his way. It still didn't feel real. He took a deep breath and let the warmth of the diner wrap around him like a cocoon, holding off the cold world outside for just a little while longer. It had been so long since he'd had the luxury of sitting somewhere without worrying about how long he could stay before being asked to leave. He glanced down at the folder again, the official-looking letterhead staring back at him. The name of the company, the salary, the benefits, the start date, next Monday, less than a week away. The waitress returned, wiping down the table next to him, and shot him a knowing look. You're still holding on to that thing like it's gonna disappear, she said with a small smile. David chuckled, shaking his head. Feels like it might. She tucked her rag into the pocket of her apron and leaned on the counter. Well, I don't know much, but I do know this. You don't look like a man who's gonna let this slip through his fingers. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the chill of the evening air hit him immediately, but he barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking about where he'd sleep that night. The shelter he'd been staying at would still have a bed for him, but if things went well, he wouldn't need it much longer. He walked with purpose now, his steps steady, his shoulders back. He hadn't felt this sure of himself in years. He knew the city like the back of his hand, the shortcuts, the hidden alleys, the places to avoid. It had been his home, even when he had no real home to go to. And now, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving it. He was moving forward. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He fished it out, his stomach tightening slightly as he saw John's name flashing on the screen. A part of him had expected the call but hadn't been ready for it just yet. He hesitated for a second, then answered. "Hey." "Man," John exhaled on the other end. "I still can't believe it's really you." David smiled slightly, leaning against a street lamp. "Yeah, me neither." There was a pause, then John's voice softened. "You really okay?" David considered the question. The easy answer was yes. He had a job, a plan, a path forward. But the real answer was more complicated. The scars of the past weren't something that disappeared overnight. They clung to him, whispering doubts in the back of his mind, reminding him of every time he had tried and failed before. But this time was different. "I think I'm getting there," he admitted. John sighed in relief. "That's good, man. That's really good." There was another pause before he added, "Look, I know it's been a long time, but you know you don't have to do this alone, right?" David swallowed hard. "I appreciate that. Seriously," John continued, "if you need a place to crash even just for a couple nights, I'll be okay." David cut in gently. "I'm trying to do this right, on my own terms." John didn't argue, just let out a quiet chuckle. "Stubborn as ever." "Yeah," David said, smiling faintly. "Guess some things don't change." They talked a little longer, about nothing in particular, old memories, mutual friends, things that had happened while David had been off the grid. It felt strange, slipping back into conversation with someone from his past, someone who hadn't given up on him even when he'd all but disappeared. It reminded him that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything. As the call ended, David felt something settle inside him, a sense of belonging, however small, a reminder that even after everything, there were still people who cared. The city stretched out ahead of him, filled with both uncertainty and possibility. He took a deep breath and started walking again, his future waiting just a few blocks away. David walked for a while, letting the city guide him as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The streets, once his greatest source of struggle, now felt like something different. Familiar, yes, but no longer suffocating. Each step carried him forward, away from the past that had weighed him down for so long. He passed by the park where he used to sleep, his usual bench now occupied by an older man wrapped in a tattered coat. David slowed his pace for a moment, an odd sense of detachment washing over him. That had been him not long ago, just another invisible person lost in the city's constant motion. But now, things were changing. He had a job, a purpose, a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. But the reality of it all hadn't fully sunk in yet. He stopped near a small convenience store, debating whether to go inside. His pockets weren't empty anymore, but old habits died hard. For so long, he had been forced to stretch every penny, to weigh every decision against the question of survival. Even now, despite knowing he had money to spend, the idea of buying something just for himself felt almost foreign. After a few seconds, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the rows of shelves. He moved slowly through the aisles, his fingers brushing against the familiar packaging of things he had gone without for too long. A granola bar, a bottle of water, a pack of gum. Small things, but things he could buy without hesitation now. He took them to the counter, placing them down carefully as the cashier, a young woman with earbuds in, barely glanced up from her phone. The total flashed on the screen, and David reached into his pocket, pulling out the bills without needing to count them first. It was a simple moment, an everyday transaction, but to him, it meant more than he could put into words. As he stepped back onto the street, his phone vibrated again. He pulled it out, expecting another call from John, but instead, it was an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. Hello? A pause, then a warm, familiar voice. David, it's Warren. David's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear from him again, not this soon, maybe not ever. Mr. Buffett, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Didn't expect a call from you. A soft chuckle came through the line. Well, I didn't expect to run into you that day either, but life is funny like that. David leaned against a nearby street lamp, gripping the phone a little tighter. I got the job. I know, Warren said. I checked in with them this morning. David blinked. You did? Of course, Warren replied. When I said I'd take an interest, I meant it. A wave of emotion swelled in David's chest. He wasn't used to people following through, to people actually caring beyond a fleeting moment of kindness. I don't know how to thank you, he admitted. You don't have to, Warren said simply. Just make the most of it. David nodded even though Warren couldn't see him. I will. There was a brief silence. Then Warren spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. Tell me something, David. What's your plan now? David exhaled slowly, looking up at the sky as if the answer might be written there. Honestly, just take it one day at a time, get through the first week, prove I belong there. That's a good start, Warren said, but I want you to think bigger. David frowned. Bigger. You've spent so long surviving that you've forgotten how to plan for a future, Warren said gently. But now you have one, and I want you to think about what you want it to look like. David swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling over him. A future. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to dream of anything beyond the next meal, the next night with a roof over his head. I don't know, he admitted quietly. That's okay, Warren said, but I want you to start thinking about it, and when you do, I want you to call me. David blinked. Call you? Warren chuckled. I don't give my number out to just anyone, David, but I see something in you, and I want to see where you go from here. David gripped the phone tighter, overwhelmed by the offer. Thank you. I won't waste it. I know you won't, Warren said. Now go get some rest. Monday's a big day. David nodded again, this time with a small smile. Yeah, it is. As the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, his heart still racing. He wasn't alone in this. For the first time in years, someone believed in him. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe in himself too. David stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand, as the city continued to move around him. Warren Buffett had just given him something he hadn't felt in years. More than just kindness, more than just a second chance. He had given him faith. Faith that David could be something more than just a man clawing his way through survival. Faith that he could build something. That his future could be more than just getting by. The thought was almost too much to process. A cold wind rushed through the streets, snapping him back into the present. He tucked his phone away and started walking again, not entirely sure where he was headed, only knowing that he couldn't stand still. His mind was racing too fast, his emotions too raw to just go back to the shelter and lie down like nothing had changed. Because everything had. He turned down a quieter street, the noise of the city fading slightly. The buildings here were old, worn by time, much like he was. He passed a laundromat, the scent of detergent and warm air spilling out onto the sidewalk. A memory surfaced. Years ago, sitting with his mom in a laundromat just like this, watching the dryers spin while she counted change for the next load. Back then, he never thought twice about having clean clothes, about the little luxuries that life handed him without question. It wasn't until those things were gone that he realized just how much they mattered. His own clothes were still the same ones he had been wearing for weeks, washed only when he could manage it, worn thin from time and circumstance. He stopped walking and stared through the glass doors. Inside, a mother helped her young son fold tiny shirts, laughing as he tried to ball them up instead. An elderly man sat on one of the plastic chairs, reading a newspaper as his clothes tumbled in the dryer. Just a simple, everyday scene. He reached into his pocket, feeling the bills he had left after buying his meal. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a wash. Enough to take one more step toward feeling like a person again. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The warmth hit him instantly, wrapping around him like a long-lost comfort. A few people glanced up, but no one paid him much attention. He was just another customer, another person going about their business. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider. He approached the change machine and slid in a few bills, watching as the quarters clattered down into the tray. He gathered them up and found an empty machine near the back. Slowly, methodically, he peeled off his jacket and began emptying his pockets, pulling out the few belongings he always kept on him. A small pocket knife, a crumpled receipt from a bus ticket he had never used, the folded business card Warren Buffett had given him. He ran his thumb over the raised letters, grounding himself in the reality of it all. Then, carefully, he placed his clothes into the washer, poured in the detergent, and fed the quarters into the slot. The machine rumbled to life, the water rushing in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to just sit. He leaned back against the wall, staring at the spinning drum, the hum of the machines filling the quiet spaces in his mind. It was such a small thing, washing his clothes, but it felt monumental. It felt like he was washing away more than just the dirt and the city grime. He was washing away the weight of the past, the years of struggle, the nights spent shivering under the stars, wondering if he would make it to the morning. As the cycle continued, he let his eyes drift shut, exhaustion finally catching up to him. But this time, it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from hopelessness. It was the kind that came from moving forward. A light tap on his shoulder jolted him awake. He blinked, disoriented, until he saw the elderly man who had been reading the newspaper earlier standing beside him. The man smiled kindly. "Sorry to wake you, son. Your washer stopped a few minutes ago." David sat up quickly, rubbing his eyes. "Oh, thanks." "No problem," the man said, then nodded toward the washer. "First wash?" David hesitated, then chuckled softly. "First one in a long time." The old man nodded knowingly, as if he understood more than he let on. "Feels good, doesn't it?" David swallowed, his throat tight. "Yeah, it does." The man patted his shoulder. "Keep going, son. You're on the right path." David watched as he shuffled back to his seat, then turned to pull his clothes from the washer. He took his time folding them, smoothing out the fabric, letting himself enjoy the simple act of having clean clothes again. When he stepped back outside, the sky had darkened, the city lights flickering to life. He felt lighter, the weight of his old life loosening its grip just a little more. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, the road ahead didn't seem impossible. He started walking again, but this time, he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He had somewhere to be. He had a future waiting for him. And as he turned the corner, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. David walked down the street, feeling lighter than he had in years. The city was the same, cars honking, people rushing, neon signs flickering in the night, but something inside him had shifted. He had clean clothes on his back, a full stomach, and the weight of Warren Buffett's business card in his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he had something more than just the will to keep going. He had a future. As he turned the corner, he caught sight of his reflection in a storefront window. For a moment, he almost didn't recognize himself. His shoulders weren't hunched in defeat, and there was a look in his eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. He stopped and really looked at himself. His hair was still a little unkempt, his face lined with the hardships of the last few years. But there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there when he woke up that morning. Hope. The thought made his chest tighten. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant believing that things could change, that he wasn't doomed to spend the rest of his life clawing his way through each day. He had learned the hard way that hope could be ripped away just as quickly as it appeared. But this time, it felt different. He kept walking, hands tucked into his pockets as he made his way toward the shelter. He wasn't planning on staying there much longer. He couldn't. Not now. He had a job waiting for him, an opportunity that could change everything. And the thought of waking up in that cramped room surrounded by the sound of quiet suffering made his skin crawl. But before he could move forward, he had to go back. The shelter was a squat brick building wedged between a liquor store and a boarded-up laundromat. The fluorescent lights outside flickered, casting strange shadows on the sidewalk. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of disinfectant and stale coffee hitting him immediately. The front desk was manned by a woman named Janine, who had been working there for as long as David could remember. She looked up when he entered, her tired eyes widening slightly in surprise. Well, she said, leaning on the counter. You clean up nice. David chuckled, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, figured it was about time. Janine nodded approvingly. What brings you back? You need a bed for the night? He shook his head. Actually, I came to talk to someone. Her brow furrowed. Who? David hesitated. James. Janine's expression softened. He's in the back. You sure you want to do this? David exhaled, nodding. Yeah, I need to. She didn't press further, just waved him through. David made his way down the dimly lit hallway, past rows of metal bunk beds where men sat hunched over, lost in their own battles. Some looked up as he passed, others didn't bother. He spotted James near the end of the room, sitting on the bottom bunk, hands clasped together as he stared at the floor. David stopped in front of him. Hey! James looked up, his lined face filled with something David couldn't quite place. Relief? Shame? Regret? Maybe all three. You're alive, James muttered. David smirked. Yeah. Surprised? James shook his head. Not really. Just didn't expect to see you back here. David sat down on the empty bunk across from him. I got a job. James's eyebrows lifted slightly. No kidding? Yeah, David said, leaning forward. An actual job, one with a paycheck. A future James studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. You deserve it. David wasn't sure if that was true, but he appreciated the sentiment. He hesitated before speaking again. I wanted to say thank you. James scoffed. For what? For keeping me sane when I was at my lowest, David said. For reminding me I wasn't completely alone. James waved a dismissive hand. I didn't do anything special. You did, David insisted. And I want you to know, I'm not leaving you behind. James tensed slightly. What do you mean? David pulled out a slip of paper from his pocket. There's a place downtown, a veterans assistance program. They help with housing, job placement, all of it. I talked to a guy there earlier. He said they've got a spot for you if you want it. James stared at the paper like it was something foreign. David, no excuses, David cut in. No talking yourself out of it. I know how this place eats at you. You don't have to stay here. James swallowed hard, his fingers curling around the slip of paper. You really think they'll help? I know they will. James sat back, exhaling slowly. Damn, he muttered. You really are turning things around. David smiled. Took me long enough. They sat in silence for a moment before James finally nodded. All right, I'll go. Relief flooded David's chest. Good. I'll check in on you, make sure they're treating you right. James chuckled. Guess I don't have a choice, huh? Nope, David said, standing up. See you soon, James. James looked up at him, something like pride in his tired eyes. Yeah, you will. David turned and walked back down the hallway, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He was done just surviving. It was time to start living, and he wasn't leaving anyone behind. As he stepped back onto the street, the city felt different again. Not just a place he was passing through, but a place where he belonged, where he could build something real. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Warren Buffett's business card once more. He traced his fingers over the name, letting the reality sink in. He had a future waiting for him, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. David walked through the city streets, the weight of everything that had happened pressing against his chest. The cool night air wrapped around him, and for once, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt fresh. For years, he had wandered these same streets, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, avoiding the looks of those who saw him as nothing more than another lost soul. But tonight, his posture was different. His steps had purpose. His gaze was steady. For the first time in years, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He reached a small park near the river, one of the places he used to sleep when the shelters were full. It was quiet now, the hum of the city distant but ever present. The bench he used to call his bed was still there, worn and splintered. He ran his fingers over the rough wood, remembering the countless nights he had spent staring at the sky, wondering if his life would ever change. It had. A part of him wanted to leave the past behind, to forget this place and never look back. But another part of him knew that was impossible. He would always carry those nights with him, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe remembering would keep him from ever going back. He sat down, letting himself take in the moment. He had a job now, a future, a plan. And yet, there was still one more thing left to do. He pulled out his phone, staring at the contact he had saved earlier that day. Warren Buffett. The man who had changed everything with just a conversation, who had seen something in David that even he had forgotten existed. He had promised to check in, and David had promised to call. His fingers hovered over the screen. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. Thank you? That didn't feel like enough. He had spent years thinking no one saw him, and then this one man, a billionaire of all people, had taken the time to listen, to believe in him. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. David. Buffett's voice was warm, steady. I was hoping I'd hear from you. David swallowed. Yeah, I got the job. Just signed the papers today. There was a pause, then a chuckle. I had a feeling you would. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I just wanted to say, thank you. I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for that conversation. You would have found your way, Buffett said. You already had everything you needed. You just needed someone to remind you. David didn't know what to say to that. The old him would have argued, would have said that he was nothing more than a failure. But now, he wasn't so sure. I won't waste it, David said finally. I know you won't, Buffett replied. And remember, this isn't just about you. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. Pass it on. David nodded, even though the man on the other end of the line couldn't see him. I will. Good, Buffett said. Now go enjoy your first night knowing you have a future ahead of you. David laughed softly. I think I will. They said their goodbyes, and David sat there for a long time, the phone still in his hand. The city stretched out before him, the lights flickering against the dark sky. He had spent so long feeling trapped, like he was running in circles with no way out. But now, the world felt open again. He stood up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. There was still work to do, still battles to fight, But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Tomorrow, he would walk into that office and start his new job. Tomorrow, he would begin rebuilding his life. And tomorrow, for the first time in a long time, he would wake up knowing that he had something to look forward to. A future, a purpose, hope. David walked away from the park, his hands tucked into his pockets as he let the city guide him. The streets were familiar, but they felt different now, like they were finally opening up to him instead of shutting him out. The weight on his shoulders wasn't gone, but it was lighter. The ghosts of his past were still there, whispering in the back of his mind, but they no longer had the power to pull him under. He was still here. And for the first time in years, he was moving forward. He passed a group of men huddled near the entrance of a closed storefront, their belongings piled in makeshift beds of blankets and backpacks. He knew their struggle, knew the exhaustion in their faces, the way they kept their heads down as if trying to disappear. Once, he had been one of them. One of the men, wrapped in an old coat that was too thin for the cold, glanced up as David walked past. Their eyes met, and for a split second, David saw a flicker of recognition. "Hey, man," the guy mumbled. "You got anything to spare?" David stopped. Just days ago, he would have been the one asking. Just days ago, he might have been sitting right there with them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He had just enough cash to get through the next couple of days before his first paycheck. He hesitated. His survival instincts told him to hold on to every dollar, to be careful, to prepare for the worst, because the worst had always come. But then he remembered Warren Buffett's words. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. Pass it on. David pulled out a 20 and held it out. "Here," he said. "Get yourself something to eat." The man looked at him in surprise, then took the bill with a grateful nod. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it." David nodded. "I know what it's like." The man studied him for a moment, as if trying to place where he'd seen him before. Maybe he had. Maybe they'd crossed paths at a shelter, or a soup kitchen, or some forgotten street corner. But tonight, David was standing on the other side of the conversation. It didn't make him better. It just made him lucky. As he turned to leave, the man called after him. "Hey, you doing better now?" David stopped, then glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." He kept walking, the encounter sitting heavy in his chest. He had spent so much time just trying to survive that he had forgotten what it felt like to be in a position to help. Even something as small as $20. It was nothing to most people, but to someone on the streets, it could be the difference between hunger and a warm meal. He thought about Michael, his little brother, about the nights they had spent huddled together, trying to stay warm. Michael had been the only thing that kept him going back then, but David hadn't been able to save him. The memory ached, the guilt creeping in like it always did, but tonight it didn't swallow him whole. He reached the subway station and stepped onto the platform, leaning against the cold metal railing as he waited for the next train. The city pulsed around him, a never-ending current of people coming and going. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a spam email or a random notification, but instead, it was a message from John. "Proud of you, man. Let's grab dinner soon. On me." David smiled to himself. Just a few days ago, he had been completely alone. Now, he had people who cared, a job, a future. The train arrived, and he stepped inside, finding an empty seat near the window. He stared at his reflection in the glass, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. He looked alive, hopeful. As the train rumbled forward, carrying him toward the next chapter of his life, David made a silent promise to himself. He would never forget where he came from. He would never take this second chance for granted. And someday, when he was in an even better position, he would do more than just hand out $20 bills. He would find a way to change someone's life the way Warren Buffett had changed his. Because if there was one thing he had learned, It was this. Sometimes, all it took was one moment, one conversation, one person willing to see you, to believe in you. And when that happened, everything could change. David stepped off the subway and into the cool night air. The city was quieter now, the rush-hour crowds thinning, leaving only the steady hum of late-night traffic and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby bar. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the cold. His feet carried him toward the small apartment complex on the corner, the place he could now call home, at least for now. It wasn't much, just a tiny studio with barely enough room for a bed and a table. But after years of sleeping on benches, in shelters, and on cold concrete, it felt like a palace. As he climbed the stairs to the second floor, a familiar weight settled in his chest. The past still clung to him, the years of struggle not so easily shaken. Even with a job, even with a roof over his head, he couldn't shake the fear that it could all disappear in an instant. Inside, the apartment was quiet, almost eerily so. He set his folder on the small table near the window and took a deep breath. He had made it this far. That had to count for something. He flicked on the small lamp near his bed, casting a dim glow over the room. His mattress sat on the floor, a few thrift store blankets piled on top. A duffel bag in the corner held the entirety of his possessions: clothes, a few toiletries, and a book he had picked up from a free library down the street. It wasn't much, but it was his. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his notifications. A few missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Probably bill collectors from the past life he had left behind. He let out a slow breath and set the phone down. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that the cheeseburger and fries from earlier had only held him over for so long. He made his way to the tiny kitchenette, opening the fridge with cautious optimism. A half-empty carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and some peanut butter. Not exactly a feast, but it was food. As he made himself a sandwich, his mind drifted to the man he had given the $20 to earlier. He wondered if he had used it to get food, or if he was still out there in the cold, looking for shelter. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He had spent so much of his life on the receiving end of generosity, always waiting for a helping hand, a stroke of luck, or a moment of kindness. But now, for the first time, he was on the other side. He had something to give, no matter how small. Sitting at the table, he picked up the business card Warren Buffett had given him and turned it over in his fingers. The old man had seen something in him, something David hadn't even seen in himself. He had a job now, but was that enough? Could he do more? The thought unsettled him. For years, his only goal had been survival, getting through the day, finding the next meal, avoiding the cold. But now he had something he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a long time. Options. He could work his way up in the company, save money, build a real life. He could reach out to others who were still struggling, find a way to help. He took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as his mind raced. Could he really do this? Could he actually have a future? The doubt crept in like an old friend, whispering in his ear, reminding him of every failure, every time life had knocked him down. But then he heard another voice, softer, yet stronger. You're not broken, David. You just need a chance. He exhaled, setting down the sandwich. Tomorrow he would wake up early, head to work, and prove to himself that he could do this. He would take it one step at a time, just like he had done every day before. But this time, he wasn't just surviving. He was rebuilding, and for the first time in years, he believed he could. David lay awake in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through his window. The quiet hum of the city outside was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the nights he had spent in shelters where every sound felt like a potential threat. His mind wouldn't slow down, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The job, the apartment, the future that no longer felt like a distant dream, but something real, something tangible. He turned over, staring at the ceiling, his body exhausted but his thoughts relentless. The idea of stability, of finally moving forward, should have brought him peace. But instead, it unsettled him. He had spent so long fighting to stay afloat that he wasn't sure what to do now that he had solid ground beneath him. The silence of his apartment was unfamiliar, almost too much. He had gotten used to the noise of the streets, the murmur of voices, the distant sirens that had once been a lullaby. Now, the absence of all that made him feel like he was in a different world entirely, one he wasn't sure he belonged to yet. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He scrolled through his missed calls again, lingering on John's name. Talking to his old friend earlier had felt like stepping back into a life he had lost, a life he had almost given up on ever reclaiming. His finger hovered over the call button. But what would he say? That he was trying? That he had a job now, a place to stay, but that he still wasn't sure he deserved it? That every step forward felt like walking on thin ice, waiting for the moment it all cracked beneath him. He locked the screen and set the phone down, rolling onto his side. Tomorrow. Tomorrow he would go to work, show up on time, do his job, and prove to himself that he was capable. One day at a time. That was the only way he could do this. The next morning, he woke up before his alarm, the nervous energy from the night before still thrumming through his veins. He got up, showered, and dressed in the clothes he had picked out the night before. A button-up shirt and slacks, both second-hand but clean and pressed. He checked his reflection in the mirror, smoothing his hair back. He looked normal, like any other man heading to work. The realization made his chest tighten. Stepping outside, the cold morning air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. He walked toward the subway, the routine already feeling different from the way he used to move through the city. Before, he had walked these streets with his head down, invisible, blending into the background. Now, he moved with purpose. He had somewhere to be. The ride to work was uneventful, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What if he messed up? What if they realized they had made a mistake in hiring him? What if he wasn't good enough? As he stepped into the building, the weight of those thoughts pressed heavier on him, but he pushed through it, one step at a time. The receptionist greeted him with a polite nod, handing him a visitor's badge for his first day. He clipped it to his shirt, swallowing hard as he followed the HR rep through the halls. The office was bright and modern, the kind of place he had never imagined himself working. Desks lined with computers, employees moving efficiently, phones ringing, conversations flowing. He felt like an outsider, like an imposter walking through a world that wasn't meant for him. His supervisor, a man named Richard, shook his hand firmly, leading him to his desk. "First days can be overwhelming," Richard said with a small smile, "but you'll get the hang of it. Just take it one task at a time." David nodded, exhaling slowly. One task at a time. The day passed in a blur of introductions, training sessions, and information that he struggled to absorb. By lunch, his head was spinning, and he found himself standing outside the building, staring at the city skyline, trying to catch his breath. He had made it through half a day. That was something. A group of co-workers passed him on their way to a cafe, laughing and chatting like they had known each other forever. He wanted to join them, to be part of something, but the fear of not belonging kept him rooted in place. Instead, he walked to the corner store, buying a cheap sandwich and a bottle of water. He sat on a bench eating in silence, his mind a storm of self-doubt. But then, something shifted. Across the street, he spotted a man sitting against a building, his head bowed, a sign resting in front of him that read, "Just trying to get back on my feet." David stared, the familiarity of the situation sinking into his bones. He had been that man, not long ago. Without thinking, he stood, walked across the street, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a $5 bill, small, insignificant, but more than he had been able to spare before. The man looked up, his eyes weary but grateful. "Thank you," he murmured. David nodded, stepping back. Take care. As he walked away, something inside him settled. Maybe he wasn't where he wanted to be yet. Maybe he was still figuring things out. But he was here. And for now, that was enough. David stepped back into his apartment that evening, shutting the door behind him with a quiet click. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His first day was over. He had made it. The weight of the day pressed down on him, exhaustion creeping into his bones. But beneath it all, there was something else. Relief. Maybe even pride. He set his bag down and sank onto the couch, running a hand over his face. His mind replayed the day over and over. The nervousness, the moments of self-doubt, the small victories. He had shown up. He had done the work. And despite the nagging voice in the back of his head telling him he didn't belong, no one had looked at him like he didn't deserve to be there. His eyes drifted to the business card on the coffee table, Warren Buffett's words still echoing in his head. You just needed a chance. He picked up the card, running his fingers over the embossed letters. He thought about calling, about telling Buffett that he had done it, that he had taken the chance and was holding on with everything he had. But some part of him knew he didn't need to. The proof wasn't in the call. It was in the life he was starting to rebuild. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from John. Proud of you, man. Let's catch up soon. David smiled, typing back a simple reply. Yeah, I'd like that. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. He had a job, a place to call home, people who cared, and maybe, just maybe, a future that didn't feel so far out of reach anymore. As he lay back, staring at the ceiling, he felt something settle inside him. Peace. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it, because he had made it through today, and that was enough.